She had scrubbed those floors on her hands and knees for 8 months. She had washed dishes no one thanked her for, pressed shirts for a man who never once looked her in the eye, and smiled quietly every time someone in that house spoke to her like she was furniture. 8 months of silence. 8 months of watching. And on this particular Friday evening in October, when 500 of the wealthiest people in New York City stood beneath crystal chandeliers inside the Grand Harlow Ballroom on Fifth Avenue, champagne in hand, laughter echoing off marble walls, the music stopped. Not because the band finished their set. Not because someone made an announcement. The music stopped because every single person in that room turned at the exact same moment toward the top of the grand staircase. And standing there, in a black evening gown that caught the light like she had been born wearing it, was the woman who just 3 days ago had been ironing their hostesses' dresses in a basement laundry room. Her name was Diane Carter. And every person in that room was about to learn something that would change the way they understood power for the rest of their lives. Before we go further, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And if you are new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Who was Diane Carter, really? Why had a woman of her obvious intelligence and composure spent 8 months working as a housekeeper inside one of Manhattan's most prominent households? Why did the woman hosting that gala, Margaret Holloway, founder of Holloway Group, one of the largest private equity firms in the country, go pale the moment she saw Diane at the top of those stairs? And why were 2 men in dark suits standing near the side exit with their hands clasped in front of them, watching the entire room like they were waiting for something? Those are the questions that matter. Because the night Diane Carter walked into that ballroom was not an accident. It was not a coincidence. And it was certainly not the beginning of the story. It was the end of one, and the beginning of something far bigger than anyone in that room had prepared for. To understand what happened that night, you have to go back. You have to go back to a hospital room in Chicago 14 months earlier, to the smell of antiseptic and old coffee, to the sound of a man's voice fading slowly beneath the weight of everything he had never been able to say out loud. Diane Carter was 51 years old, and she had spent the first half of her life watching her father build something extraordinary from nothing. His name was Robert Carter Bob to anyone who had known him back in the early days. He had grown up in a working-class neighborhood on the south side of Chicago, the son of a postal worker and a school librarian. He was not supposed to become wealthy. He was not supposed to build Carter Capital Management, a boutique investment firm that, at its peak, managed close to $400 million in assets for institutional clients across the Midwest. He did it through 20 years of discipline, honesty, and a reputation that people in the financial world whispered about the way they whispered about things that could not quite be explained. Bob Carter simply did not cut corners. He did not play games. And he did not partner with people he did not trust. Which was why, when Diane sat beside his hospital bed in September of the previous year and held his hand, she already knew something had gone terribly wrong. He had been diagnosed with congestive heart failure 6 months earlier. The decline had been fast. But it was not the illness that had broken him in those final weeks. It was something else. Something he struggled to say out loud, even to her. "I made a mistake," he told her on a Tuesday afternoon when the room was quiet and the hallway outside was still. "I let someone in who didn't belong." He closed his eyes for a moment. "She took the whole thing apart, Diane. I didn't see it until it was too late." He was talking about Margaret Holloway. Robert Carter and Margaret Holloway had entered into a strategic partnership 4 years earlier. At the time, it seemed like an intelligent move. Holloway Group had capital. Carter Capital had relationships. The idea was simple. Holloway would provide liquidity for certain larger deals that Carter could not fund alone. And in exchange, Carter would bring Holloway into client relationships it had spent decades building. It looked clean on paper. It looked reasonable. But Diane had always had a feeling about Margaret Holloway that she could not fully articulate. There was something too polished about her. Something too comfortable about the way she smiled when she was the most dangerous person in the room. Diane had met her twice over the years, and both times she came home feeling like she had been assessed rather than greeted. Her father had laughed it off. "She's just confident," he said. "You'd be confident too if you'd built what she's built." Diane had let it go. She should not have. Over the course of 3 years, Margaret Holloway had systematically restructured the partnership agreement through a series of amendments that Bob Carter, trusting and increasingly unwell, had signed without fully understanding their implications. The amendments were buried in language so technical, so deliberately obfuscated, that even Diane, who had an MBA from the University of Michigan and had worked in corporate law for a decade before stepping back to raise her daughter, had to read them 3 times before the full shape of what had happened came into focus. Margaret had effectively acquired controlling interest in Carter Capital's core client portfolio through what appeared on the surface to be routine administrative restructuring. She had not stolen the firm. She had simply made the documents say something different from what Robert Carter thought he had agreed to. And because Bob had trusted her, because he had believed that a person's reputation meant something in this business, he had not had every amendment independently reviewed. By the time Diane understood what had happened, her father had less than 3 months to live. Carter Capital had been formally dissolved, and Margaret Holloway had absorbed its most valuable client relationships into Holloway Group's existing book of business. The money was gone. The firm was gone. And her father was dying in a hospital bed, having spent his last coherent months trying to understand how a woman he had treated like a colleague had taken everything he had spent his life building. Diane held his hand. She did not cry. She wanted to. There were moments in that room where the grief pressed so hard against her chest that she could barely breathe. But she did not cry in front of him. Instead, she listened. She let him talk. She memorized every name, every date, every document reference he could still recall. And when she drove home that night, alone on the highway at 11 o'clock with nothing but the headlights and the dark, she made herself a promise that she was not going to break. Think about that for a moment. Think about what it means to sit beside someone you love while they die, knowing that the thing that broke their spirit was not illness, not age, not the natural erosion of time, but betrayal. Have you ever had someone take something from you that you worked your whole life to build? Have you ever watched someone you love carry that kind of weight in their final days? If you have, then you already understand exactly what Diane felt driving home that night. And if you haven't, consider yourself fortunate. Robert Carter passed away 11 days later on a Wednesday morning just before sunrise. The service was small. Diane wore his watch to the funeral, a simple Timex with a scratched face that he had worn every single day for 30 years. She has worn it every day since. Diane spent 3 months after her father's death doing 2 things simultaneously. On the surface, she was grieving. She was selling his Chicago condo, sorting through his papers, handling the administrative wreckage that follows the end of a person's life. Underneath that, she was building a case. She had managed to retain copies of every document her father had kept. Partnership agreements, amendment filings, correspondence, wire transfer records, and most importantly, a series of internal memos that her father had printed and kept in a manila folder at the back of his home filing cabinet, the kind of memos that had clearly never been meant for his eyes. Someone inside Holloway Group had been sending them to him anonymously in the weeks before he lost the capacity to act on them. Diane did not know who had sent them, but she was grateful, because those memos described in plain language what the amendments had been designed to accomplish, who had drafted them, and, most critically, that the process by which they had been executed may have constituted securities fraud. She hired an attorney, not a big firm, not someone who would be recognized. A quiet, methodical woman named Patricia Green who worked out of a 2-room office in downtown Chicago and who had spent 30 years doing exactly this kind of work. Patricia read everything. She called Diane a week later and said, "This is real, but we need more. We need evidence from inside." Diane already knew that. She had known it since the night she read the memos for the first time. The question was how to get it. Margaret Holloway was not careless. She ran her household the same way she ran her business, controlled, insulated, with multiple layers between herself and anything that could be used against her. Her Upper East Side townhouse was staffed with people she had vetted. Her office had security that most government buildings would envy. She did not make obvious mistakes. But Diane had noticed something. She had noticed it in her father's stories, in the memos, in the small details that accumulated over time into a pattern. Margaret Holloway was comfortable at home in a way she was not comfortable anywhere else. At home, she spoke freely. At home, she kept things she would never keep in an office. At home, she was not performing for anyone. Diane spent 2 weeks thinking about how to use that. Then she applied for a housekeeping position through a staffing agency that Margaret Holloway's household manager used to fill domestic roles. She did not use her real name on the application. She used her mother's maiden name, Diane Wells. She had a fabricated work history that Patricia Green had helped her construct carefully enough to survive the background check the agency ran. She was 51 years old, quiet, well-spoken, and presented herself during the interview as someone who had spent years in private household service and simply wanted stable, respectful employment. She got the position in 3 days. And on a Monday morning in February, Diane Carter, who had a law degree and MBA, and was the sole heir to an estate that, before Margaret Holloway's amendments, would have been worth several $1,000,000, arrived at the Holloway townhouse at 7:30 in the morning with a uniform in her bag and a plan that had taken 4 months to build. She said good morning to the household manager, a nervous young man named Todd who spoke very fast and apologized for everything. She accepted a cup of coffee she did not finish, and she began to work. Now ask yourself honestly, could you have done that? Could you have walked into the home of the person who had taken everything from your father, who had watched him die carrying the weight of that betrayal, and said good morning and poured coffee and made the bed and cleaned the bathroom, day after day, week after week, without ever revealing what you knew, without ever letting the anger show? That is not a small thing. That is a level of discipline that most people, if they are honest with themselves, do not have. But Diane Carter had it, because she understood something that her father had understood too, just perhaps too late. Patience is not weakness. Patience, when it is purposeful, is the most powerful thing a person can possess. If this story has your heart racing right now, drop a comment and let us know what you are thinking. Would you have had the patience to do what Diane did? We genuinely want to hear from you. And if you have been watching this far, do us a favor and hit the subscribe button. We release new stories every week and you do not want to miss what comes next. 8 months inside the Holloway household taught Diane things that no document could have told her. She learned the rhythm of the house. She learned which rooms Margaret spent the most time in. She learned which calls she took standing at the kitchen window, which ones she took behind the closed door of her study, and which ones she walked out into the back garden for, her voice dropping to almost nothing. She learned that Margaret kept her most sensitive personal files not in her office at Holloway Group headquarters, but in a locked drawer of an antique writing desk on the 2nd floor. A desk that Diane dusted around every single Thursday morning. She learned that Margaret had a standing dinner on the first Wednesday of every month with a man named Gerald Fitch, who was a senior partner at the law firm that had drafted the Carter Capital Partnership amendments. She learned that Margaret drank 1 glass of scotch every evening at 6 o'clock and that in those 20 minutes, she tended to make phone calls that she never would have made from her office. Diane did not record those calls. She did not photograph documents. She did not do anything that could be described as illegal, because Patricia Green had been very clear with her from the beginning. Anything obtained improperly would not only be inadmissible, it would undermine everything they were trying to build. What Diane did instead was observe. She documented timelines. She noted names. She confirmed the existence of relationships that the memos had referenced. She built a map. And slowly, carefully, the map became something that Patricia Green could take to people who had the authority to act on it. In her 6th month inside the house, something happened that Diane had not anticipated. One of Margaret's regular dinner guests, a woman named Claire Whitmore who sat on the board of 2 different financial institutions, arrived one evening visibly distressed. Diane served the appetizers, refilled the water glasses, and moved through the dining room the way she always did. Quietly, efficiently, as though she were not entirely there. But she heard enough. Claire Whitmore had been approached by someone from the SEC. Not formally, not yet, but someone had been asking questions. Margaret had gone very still at the table. Not afraid, Margaret Holloway did not do fear in the ordinary way, but calculating. The dinner ended early. After Claire left, Margaret sat alone in her study for 45 minutes. Diane, who was tidying the kitchen down the hall, heard her make 3 separate phone calls. The first 2 were short. The third lasted 22 minutes, and though Diane could not hear the specifics, she could hear the shape of the conversation. The long pauses, the clipped sentences, the particular silence that follows when someone is being told something they do not want to hear. When Margaret finally came out of the study, she walked directly past Diane without seeing her. She poured herself a second scotch, the first time Diane had ever seen her do that, and stood at the kitchen window for a long moment looking out at nothing. Diane kept wiping the counter. She did not look up. But inside, she felt something shift. The clock was moving. It was time to accelerate. She called Patricia the next morning from a coffee shop 2 blocks from the townhouse. Patricia had news. The SEC inquiry that Claire Whitmore had mentioned was real. It had been opened based on a complaint that Patricia, working through channels that Diane did not need to know the details of, had helped engineer 9 weeks earlier. It was not yet a formal investigation, but it was close. And there was a second development. One of the former Carter Capital clients, a pension fund manager in Cleveland named Arthur Baines, who had watched his fund's relationship with Carter get absorbed into Holloway Group without ever being properly notified, had agreed to provide a sworn statement. Arthur Baines was 67 years old, retired, and deeply angry. He had been friends with Robert Carter for 20 years. He had attended Bob's funeral. And when Patricia Green had called him and explained what she believed had happened, he had said, quietly, without drama, "Tell me what you need." His statement, combined with the documents Diane had helped locate and the timeline she had constructed over 8 months, gave Patricia enough to do something that neither of them had been fully certain was possible. File a civil fraud complaint with enough substance behind it that it would be very difficult to make disappear. They filed on a Thursday. By the following Friday, the complaint had been picked up by a financial news outlet whose editor had been watching Holloway Group for 2 years. By Saturday, the story was everywhere. And by Sunday morning, when Diane arrived at the Holloway townhouse for what she already knew would be her last shift, Todd, the household manager, met her at the door, looking like he had not slept in 3 days. "Ms. Holloway won't be needing staff this week," he said. He could not quite meet her eyes. "We'll be in touch." Diane nodded. She thanked him. She walked back down the front steps of the townhouse for the last time, and she did not look back. What happened next was not what most people would have predicted. The gala at the Grand Harlow Ballroom had been on Margaret Holloway's social calendar for 8 months. A fundraising event for a children's arts foundation that she had chaired for years and that, whatever else she was, she appeared to genuinely care about. In a strange, almost darkly ironic twist, Diane had been the one who had helped Margaret prepare for it. She had ironed the tablecloths. She had confirmed the florist's delivery. She had pressed the dress that Margaret had planned to wear. The invitation had arrived at the Holloway house in early September, a formal card in a thick cream envelope bearing the foundation's crest. And 2 days before Diane left that house for the last time, she had found a second envelope on the hallway console table, addressed to a name she did not recognize. It had not been opened. It had simply been left there, as things in wealthy households often are, waiting for someone to deal with it. On impulse, Diane had held it. She had not opened it. But the name on the envelope had stayed with her. When she got home that evening, she made a phone call. Within 48 hours, through channels that she and Patricia had developed over months, she had arranged something that could not have been arranged any other way. She was going to that gala, not as staff, not in a uniform, as herself. The dress was borrowed from a woman named Sandra Okafor, a friend of Diane's daughter who worked in fashion and who had access to sample collections that most people never see. It was deep navy, not black, though in certain light it appeared to hold both colors at once. And it fit Diane the way clothing only fits when it has been made with actual care. She wore her father's watch on her left wrist. She wore no other jewelry. She arrived at the Grand Harlow Ballroom at 8:15 on a Friday evening in October, gave her name at the door, her real name, Diane Carter, and walked up the staircase. She was not trying to make an entrance. She simply walked. But the room was the way rooms sometimes are at a certain kind of event, watchful, highly attuned to status and recognition, and the moment she appeared at the top of those stairs, something passed through it like a current. A senator's aide recognized the Carter name. Then a fund manager from Boston. Then someone who had known her father for 30 years and had not seen Diane since she was in her 20s. Whispers began to move through the crowd the way they do when information is changing hands faster than anyone can quite track. And then Margaret Holloway looked up from across the room. The distance between them was perhaps 60 feet. Felt like nothing. Felt like no distance at all. Margaret's face did not fall dramatically. It did not crumple. It simply became very still. And in that stillness, Diane saw what she had not fully allowed herself to look for over 8 months of proximity. Recognition. Margaret Holloway knew exactly who Diane Carter was. She had always known. She had hired her anyway. Diane realized in that moment. She had looked at the application for Diane Wells and understood precisely who was standing in front of her. And she had made a calculation. She had decided that having Diane inside the house, where she could be watched, was safer than having her outside it, where she could not be. It was the kind of decision that people make when they believe they are untouchable. It was also the kind of decision that, when it turns out to be wrong, becomes the most damaging mistake a person can make. Diane walked down the stairs. She crossed the ballroom floor. She stopped 3 feet in front of Margaret Holloway. She did not raise her voice. She did not reach for drama. She said, "Good evening, Margaret." And Margaret Holloway, for perhaps the first time in 20 years of social and professional performance, had nothing to say. The 2 men in dark suits near the side exit, federal investigators who had been coordinating with Patricia Green's team for 6 weeks, stepped forward at that point. Not dramatically, not with handcuffs or cameras. Quietly, professionally. One of them asked Margaret to step outside with them for a moment. She went. The room watched. The music, which had stopped, did not start again for a long time. The civil fraud case against Margaret Holloway took 14 months to resolve. It did not go to criminal trial, though the SEC's parallel investigation resulted in a consent decree, a substantial fine, and the formal dissolution of Holloway Group's asset management division. The civil complaint that Patricia Green had filed on Diane's behalf was settled out of court in the spring of the following year. The terms were confidential. Diane has never publicly disclosed the amount. What she has said in the one interview she gave to a financial journalist who had covered her father's career years earlier was that the settlement was not really about the money. "My father spent his life building something real," she said. "The money matters. But what mattered more to me was that the record showed what actually happened. That it didn't just disappear." Arthur Baines, the pension fund manager from Cleveland, received a partial recovery for his clients. He sent Diane a letter afterward. She keeps it in the same manila folder as her father's memos. Todd, the household manager, found a new position within 2 months. Diane had no ill feelings toward him. He had been an employee same as she had been or appeared to have been. She sent him a brief, kind note when she heard he had landed somewhere new. That is the kind of person she is. She does not carry the anger further than it needs to go. What stayed with her, she said in that interview, was a moment that happened not on the night of the gala, but 3 days before she left the Holloway townhouse for the last time. She was in the laundry room in the basement folding linens. It was early morning. The house was quiet. And for a moment, just a moment, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of everything. The 8 months, the grief, the discipline required to move through another person's home every single day carrying something that heavy and not once letting it show. She sat down on a wooden stool in that basement laundry room, and she put her hands over her face, and she let herself cry for the first time since her father's funeral. Not for long. Not with any drama. Just for a few minutes, alone, with the sound of the dryer turning and the faint smell of detergent in the air. Then she stood up. She folded the last set of sheets. She put them on the shelf. And she went back upstairs. There is something in that image. A woman sitting in a basement, crying quietly where no one can see her, then standing up and going back to work. That feels more true to the reality of how people actually get through the hardest things in their lives than almost anything else I could tell you. We do not get through grief and betrayal and injustice in dramatic moments at the top of staircases, though those moments matter too. We get through them in the ordinary, invisible places, in the quiet rooms where no one is watching. And then we stand up, and we go back upstairs. Think about that. Think about the people in your own life who have carried something enormous without ever letting you see the weight of it. Think about whether you have ever been in a room with someone and failed to understand what they were actually carrying, what quiet dignity they were maintaining while you were looking past them. We do that more than we realize. We look past people. We make assumptions about what their life contains based on the role they happen to be playing in ours. And sometimes, the person we are looking past is the most remarkable person in the room. Diane Carter's father built something real. Someone took it, and his daughter, in her own way, in her own time, on her own terms, built something back. Not the same thing. Something different. Something that was hers. So I want to ask you something before you go. If you had been in Diane's position, if someone had taken something from your father, something he had spent his whole life building, and you had the intelligence and the patience and the access to do something about it, what would you have done? Would you have had the discipline to do what she did? To walk into that house every single morning, to fold those sheets, to refill those glasses, to say good morning and mean it, while carrying everything you knew. And if you had been at that gala, if you had been one of the 500 people in that room when Diane Carter walked through those doors, would you have recognized what you were seeing? Or would you have been one of the people who looked past her? That is the question that stays with me longest about this story. Not the fraud. Not the settlement. Not the gala moment that everyone talks about when they talk about this case. What stays with me is the basement laundry room. The folded sheets. The standing back up. Because that is where the real story happened. Not in the ballroom. Down there, alone, where no one was watching. If the story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment and tell us. Was there a moment in Diane's story that hit you personally? A moment where you thought, I have felt something like that? We read every single comment, and your words matter to us more than you know. And if you are not subscribed yet, now is a good time. Because we have more stories coming that are just as real, just as human, and just as unforgettable as this one. We will see you in the next video.